Good morning, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to join us at the Laureate Lecture of 2024 Tang Prize in Rule of Law. I'm Angela Liu, your MC for today's event. To begin with, we would like to invite to the stage the host of this lecture, Professor Ye Junrong, Chair Professor of National Taiwan University, to give us the introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Ye.
Professor Mary Robinson, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is our greatest pleasure to have Professor Mary Robinson, the 2024 Tang Prize Laureate in Rule of Law with us today, to share her remarkable insights on the evolving path of the rule of law through the lens of the remarkable experience in safeguarding human rights and promoting global justice. The 2024 Tang Prize in Rule of Law appreciated Professor Robinson's invaluable contribution to the rule of law, as shown in her powerful advocacy on behalf of the most marginalized in different spheres, including gender equality, human rights, poverty alleviation, climate justice, and many more. Professor Robinson's contributions are unique by nature. For decades, she innovatively combined her legal acumen with practical values and facilitated the various positions she has served to bring rights and justice to real practice. And her works on the above-mentioned issues have come across the boundary of legal and political realms and range from domestic and regional to international levels. Professor Robinson is a strong believer in the function of law as instrument to bring real changes. This is particularly important as our world today is facing unprecedented challenges that require legal wisdom more than ever before. While some parts of the world are still recovering from the impact of the pandemic, the threat of the climate change and environmental problems are right in front of the door. Our technology is developing in full speed, but at the same time, the regulatory mechanism and human rights protection standard may not be ready to deal with the risk. This whole picture seems to get worse when we turn to the armed conflicts. There seems to be intensifying rather than coming to an end. It becomes grand questions for all of us whether the rule of law remains relevant. And if yes, how is it relevant? In fact, we must admit that the evolving path of the rule of law in both essence and structure has raised some concern recently. We have witnessed the trend of democratic backsliding and the rise of authoritarian rules in some states that are slowly changing the landscape. We also realize that the ability to shape legal discourse does not only lie in the hands of state actors, but also in the hands of non-state ones. With the present, that is getting stronger. Things are getting complicated with the existence of intertwined norms at local, national, regional, and international levels, enhanced by the trend of globalization, all which have caused the mission to safeguard and promote the rule of law harder than ever before. Facing so many challenges, now may be the perfect timing for us to revisit the concept of rule of law and to remap the role of each actor involved in the evolving process. Professor Robinson's lecture today, with title, Rebuilding Respect for Rule of Law, an Urgent Task, a Shared Responsibility, will lead us to take a closer look at the factors that work behind the changes, aiming to find practical ways to enhance and promote the rule of law. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Professor Mary Robinson.
Thank you. That's lovely. That's perfect. Happy Teachers' Day. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you and a distinct honor to receive the 2024 Tang Prize in Rule of Law. I'm grateful to the Tang Prize Foundation and Selection Committee for this recognition, and I warmly congratulate my fellow awardees being honored this year. As I said at the ceremony yesterday, when I learned of receiving the 2024 Tang Prize, it was a delight to know that I was joining a group of distinguished previous recipients who've done so much to advance human rights and respect for the rule of law in their own countries and around the world. Allow me to briefly acknowledge each of them, starting with the first two Rule of Law Prize winners, my good friends, Judge Albie Sachs of South Africa and Louise Arbour of Canada. They have both been personal inspirations to me over the years and examples for so many, not only in their home countries as judges and advocates, but as leaders on the global stage. During my time as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, I stressed the vital role of civil society organizations in all regions that play in holding governments to account for shortcomings in implementing their own human rights commitments. I therefore very much welcome the 2020 Tang Prize being jointly awarded to the Bangladesh Environmental Lawyers Association, the Colombia-based De Justicia, and the Legal Agenda in Lebanon. These three organizations have each made distinct contributions by advocating for the most marginalized and demanding justice for communities harmed by climate change and other forms of environmental damage. Awarding the Tang Prize to leading academics and thinkers in our field is to be applauded as well. The selection of Professor Joseph Raj in 2018 and Professor Cheryl Saunders in 2022 recognizes the importance of rigorous scholarship in continually assessing progress and pushing for strengthened efforts to uphold respect for rule of law and good governance at all levels. All these previous Tang Prize recipients and their work should serve as reminders that advancing respect for the rule of law is an ongoing task and a shared responsibility that remains crucial today, perhaps more so than at any point in our lifetimes. And this is so for two main reasons. First, because we face multiple global crises, where established as well as still emerging legal standards and institutions are critical to collective responses. Legal systems and governing institutions that fully adhere to rule of law principles play a key role in addressing our most pressing challenges, from halting the climate and nature crisis to tackling the dangers of global pandemics to ending armed conflict and violence in countries around the world. Second, the rule of law is so critical today because living up to the tenets of this principle is a prerequisite for healing divided societies, for rebuilding a fractured world order, and for forging consensus on how to bring about human security for all. tragic reality is that despite its vital importance, over recent decades, the rule of law itself has been increasingly questioned and threatened. As we all know, a growing number of authoritative and divisively nationalist leaders have taken steps to undermine or dismantle rule of law norms as a way to strengthen their own position and weaken accountable and inclusive governance at home and internationally. The authority of law and the shared ideal of rule of law as a foundation to protect against arbitrary use of government power continues to be severely eroded with devastating consequences. Regaining greater respect for adherence to rule of law will require real changes in how power is exercised in our world. We also need to be clear on what exactly we mean by rule of law. The World Justice Project's definition resonates with me and is consistent with most major legal traditions. It speaks of rule of law as a durable system of laws, institutions, norms, and community commitment that delivers 4 universal principles. Accountability, the understanding that governments and private actors are accountable under the law. Just law, the idea that laws are clear, publicized, stable, and applied evenly, ensuring protection of human rights as well as property, contract, and procedural rights. Open government, meaning that processes by which laws are adopted, administered, adjudicated, and enforced are acceptable, fair, and efficient. And finally, accessible and impartial justice, affirming the importance of laws being implemented in a timely manner by competent, ethical, and independent representatives who have adequate resources and reflect the communities they serve. The World Justice Project's most recent Rule of Law Index points out that as of 2023, over 6 billion people live in a country where rule of law had weakened over the previous year. As the report, which covers the large majority of nations, makes clear, these declines in the functioning of national justice systems continue to be a disturbing global trend, with more countries struggling to provide timely, affordable, and accessible justice for their people. And as we marked the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 2023, the Rule of Law Index concluded that during less than a decade, key human rights indicators have also declined at an alarming rate, most notably with civic participation falling globally by 83%, freedom of assembly by 81%, and freedom of expression by 78%. These are deeply worrying findings and part of a longer trajectory that has still not been adequately addressed by governments and world leaders. We should note that a handful of countries in different regions have managed to defy the so-called global rule of law recession by pushing back against, and in some cases reversing, authoritarian trends. These examples should be celebrated and studied, but many more countries have moved in the opposite direction for some time, with limited signs that the improvements are on the horizon. We must therefore ask the question I referred to in my acceptance speech yesterday. What has brought us to this point, when the foundational principle of rule of law, seen for so long as being at the core of global efforts to advance human rights and sustainable development, has been so undermined and threatened? What lessons must be learned from past and present actions that by design or unintended consequences have resulted in a weakening of respect for rule of law practices both nationally and globally? And last but not least, what can leaders do individually and collectively to move the world in a new and more hopeful direction, in which rule of law is once again viewed as a core element of accountable governance systems dedicated to achieving a peaceful, just, and sustainable planet for all. And equally important, what can all of us as citizens do to hold our leaders accountable and stand up for the good governance and respect for rule of law at home and around the world? These are big questions, to be sure, with no simple answers. I'd like to use my remarks today to offer some possible responses to these challenges, primarily through the lens of my own experiences as someone who's been dedicated to promoting human rights and the rule of law, first in my own country of Ireland, then as an international civil servant, and now as a private citizen, advocate and contributor to wider global movements working for climate justice, for gender equity, sustainable development, and dignity and rights for all people everywhere. I hope my reflections will help make the case that despite this perilous moment, we shouldn't underestimate the enduring moral power of good governance norms or their importance in meeting urgent challenges, and that we shouldn't ignore or forget the histories of countries from different legal traditions and cultures who have made significant progress in fostering societies where individuals and communities are able to live lives in larger freedom. Our common task now is to rebuild respect for rule of law at home and abroad, and embrace a real sense of shared responsibility for achieving a more hopeful world for current and future generations. So to begin, let me take you back to my roots in County Mayo in the west of Ireland in the ancient province of Connaught. I still recall my sense of excitement as a young lawyer in being able to invoke European community law before an Irish court to challenge discrimination against women in the workplace. In those days, I saw the potential of law to help achieve social change, and I felt strongly that it was in Ireland's interests to become part of an expanding European community of states. At a personal level, I was beginning to fully realize the sense of being both Irish and European, and of being comfortable with both identities. But I also recognized that reaching outside of Ireland could be frightening for many. Forging bonds beyond local communities and the nation needed to be about more than identities as consumers or workers. We had to be clear about the shared values that united peoples across national borders as part of a wider Europe and as members of one human family. The progress we've made in Ireland and in Europe in the years since is evident, but the work of building and maintaining bridges between peoples is never finished. We see once again today how renewed uncertainties about the future are at the heart of many fragile and fractured societies. Our rapidly changing world is marked by technological revolutions as well as a climate and nature crisis. We've built a global media ecosystem and developed emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence that offer great promise, but irresponsible actors have profited from lack of government oversight and have too often used new tools to promote misinformation and disinformation, helping fuel domestic extremism and polarization. At the same time, decades of uneven economic and social development, alongside persistent poverty and conflicts, as well as significant political shifts among nations, have all combined to leave far too many people angry, confused, and isolated, feeling left out and left behind and unheard by those with power. Such deep unease helps explain why faith in the legitimacy and effectiveness of our legal systems is widely challenged today. These vulnerabilities have been used by politicians and other influential voices to stoke divisions within and between societies. In many countries, minorities or migrants continue to be blamed for wider societal problems and portrayed as threats to national security. Again and again, regional and international institutions, civil society organizations, human rights defenders, and journalists are attacked as being foreign, or even worse, labeled as enemies of the people. I saw these troubling developments begin to take hold following the terrorist attacks on the United States in 2001. At the time, I was serving as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and witnessed how, in the days and weeks following the horrific attacks of 9/11, the values and processes associated with the rule of law were being questioned by many government leaders. I was asked, sometimes honestly, but often for more cynical political reasons, whether new threats to human security and public order, from terrorist groups to mass migration, from the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction to climate change, could be adequately confronted without rethinking or indeed putting aside rule of law, norms, and practices. At the time, my UN colleagues and I stressed that it was precisely such dangers and the changing, more interconnected world we live in that made strengthening respect for the rule of law so important. Why? Because without the rule of law, government officials weren't bound by any agreed standards of conduct. Without the rule of law, the dignity and equality of all people wouldn't be affirmed, and their ability to seek redress for grievances and fulfillment of societal commitments would be limited. Without the rule of law, there was no way to ensure meaningful participation by people in formulating and enacting the norms and standards which organize society. Sadly, despite such arguments and concerted efforts by many to guard against backsliding, we all know what happened next. First, in May 2002, the United States government decided to withdraw from any legal obligation to the Rome Statute, establishing the International Criminal Court. This act of unsigning was an unprecedented step and raised the possibility of other countries taking similar actions in the future. It signaled that the country, which had played such a central leadership role in the development of institutions and to maintain peace and security following the Second World War, was now moving in a different direction, on a path that threatened to weaken the entire international legal order. This disturbing evolution continued in the decision by the United States and its allies to invade Iraq in 2003. That war, taken without the authorization of the UN Security Council, was a further blow to the international system's legitimacy. At the time, I stressed that a war in Iraq without proper UN authorization would only serve to reinforce the skepticism of those who viewed international law as commitments that were routinely ignored by governments or selectively implemented to benefit the strong at the exclusion of the weak. In the years since, the lack of any real accountability for those decisions has severely undermined faith in the international rules-based order. Now, more than 2 decades later, the situation is even more precarious. The view that governments will ultimately only rule by power and in their own interest, rather than by law and in accordance with international standards, has taken on additional force. We've seen this play out strikingly in the unwarranted actions of the Russian government and its brutal 2022 invasion of Ukraine. In response, Western nations mobilized global norms, rules, and institutions to push back against this aggression. But the conflict continues to grind on with immense losses on both sides, even as international efforts to support Ukraine and its vision for a diplomatic solution remain in the balance. Well, one aspect of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine has been largely overlooked by the international community, and that concerns crimes against the environment. For the past 2 years, I've served alongside an esteemed group of international experts led by former Swedish Foreign Minister Margot Wallström, as well as activist Greta Thunberg, on a high-level working group on the environmental consequences of the war in Ukraine. This group was established by President Zelensky to document environmental crimes, seek legal accountability, and plan for a green recovery. It has been a sobering journey, including 2 separate visits by train to Kyiv last year, where we learned of the scale of environmental harms, ranging from the contamination of 1/3 of Ukraine's territory with landmines and unexploded ordnance, to the pollution of soils, waterways, and forests from shelling, fires, and floods. The most egregious example was the destruction of the Katovka Dam in June 2023, presumed to be an intentional act by occupying Russian forces, which flooded villages and farmlands across a wide area. The impacts go well beyond Ukraine. One study equates the greenhouse gas emissions from 12 months of the conflict as being equivalent to the emissions of a country the size of Belgium. Yet another painful reminder of ongoing conflict, in which rule of law norms continue to be openly flouted, is found in the scale of the disproportionate response by the Israeli government in Gaza to the unspeakable Hamas terrorist attack of the 7th of October 2023. As we're all aware, the scale of human suffering is intolerable, and death tolls have reached shocking levels. Over 41,000 Palestinians now reported killed by Israeli forces. Prospects for a ceasefire hang by a thread, even as fears of a wider regional war in Lebanon and perhaps beyond continue to build. The recent advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice concerning Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories, alongside a separate case brought by South Africa, alleging that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, was a landmark. As legal commentators have noted, the content of the opinion wasn't unexpected. The court essentially reconfirmed established international law by concluding that all these territories are under Israeli occupation and that the ongoing occupation is unlawful and should be brought to an end, in quotes, as rapidly as possible. The advisory ruling stresses as well that all states are under obligations, and I quote, not to recognize as legal the situation arising from Israel's unlawful presence and not to render aid or assistance in maintaining the situation created by the continued presence of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. At the end of July, 38 UN independent human rights experts appointed by governments in the Human Rights Council issued a joint statement supporting the ICJ advisory opinion. The experts made their own calls for an arms embargo to cease the sale, transfer, and diversion of arms, munitions, and other military equipment to Israel, as well as targeted sanctions on an international protective presence and investigations and prosecutions of those involved in crimes in the Palestinian territory. We cannot become numb to such unacceptable injustice and turn away from all those in Israel and Palestine yearning for peace. We must acknowledge that the lack of effective action over a long period to help resolve this conflict and bring an end to Israel's offensive in Gaza has fed perceptions of Western hypocrisy concerning the fair and consistent implementation of international law. This real sense of double standards has been even more damaging in creating a permission structure for leaders wishing to undermine or disregard their own country's human rights commitments, as well as their legal obligations in a range of other areas, from trade to climate change to arms control. We now face a moment in which the legitimacy of the rules-based international order that has been so carefully built up over more than 75 years could be on the verge of a complete unraveling. As UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has starkly put it, and I quote, "We are at grave risk of the rule of lawlessness." So where should we go from here? Given the array of threats that are so evident, what actions can we bring to take that would help turn the tide and finally put us back on a path that advocates rule of law practice and commitments. There are no easy answers, but there are principled pathways forward. Let me offer 3 broad areas that I believe should be part of wider efforts to move in a more hopeful and rights-respecting direction. First, we must renew our shared commitment to achieving the internationally agreed roadmap that is already in place, that if followed with political vision and courage, can deliver a fairer, more just and peaceful world. In 2015, the UN Sustainable Development Goals were agreed upon by a record-breaking number of governments around the world. Goal 16, for peace, justice, and strong institutions, commits nations to ensuring access to justice for all and reaffirms a shared goal of promoting the rule of law at the national and international levels. And I wear the STD badge at all times. These commitments, reaffirmed last week at the UN Summit for the Future, must be backed up by adequate resources and practical actions, beginning at the local and national levels. I've seen throughout my career, and today as chair of the Elders, the group of leaders founded by Nelson Mandela in 2007, that there are individuals and organizations in all regions and at all levels who are working to advance these goals. I've watched as women leaders have made breakthroughs around the world, resulting in greater gender equality and access to justice. They know the rule of law is a critical component in rebuilding public trust and giving people renewed confidence that institutions at all levels are working in their interest. We must ensure their voices are heard and see to it that all committed to positive change have seats at the table where decisions are made. Speaking of young people, we must give much greater attention to the issues of intergenerational justice and rights of future generations. The recently concluded UN Summit for the Future adopted, as you know, a declaration on future generations, which for the first time recognizes the need to protect those not yet born. Second, we must reaffirm that the rule of law is essential in addressing complex transnational challenges that are currently blocking efforts to achieve sustainable development. And then we must address the art of the possible. For example, over recent years, we've seen how a rights-oriented understanding of the rule of law has informed the development of international environmental law, including climate change law. But there is still much to be done. It has been greatly encouraging to see that more than 100 states have recognized the right to a healthy environment at the national level through constitutional or legislative provisions, and that this right has now been recognized internationally and incorporated into numerous regional human rights agreements and environmental treaties. But as experts point out, while these developments are positive, environmental rights are young. We must do more to make the case for this broader perspective and build the evidence base for how incorporating environmental rights into national systems shapes substantive outcomes. I welcomed the news earlier this year that the Chief Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court is developing a policy position on environmental crimes that will hopefully help give this neglected element of the Rome Statute teeth. There is growing recognition that a stronger defense of the environment is needed in law, including calls for ecocide to be adopted as an international crime. The continued rise in climate change litigation is also encouraging, as citizens assert their rights and hold governments and corporations to account via the courts, including the recent case involving Swiss pensioners, Swiss grannies, at the European Court of Human Rights. The UN Environment Programme has tracked a steady increase in cases across many jurisdictions, including international and regional courts. And these legal issues are complex, But what is undisputed is that we need stronger accountability mechanisms that hold perpetrators to account and support the recovery of the environment and communities affected. Third, we must recognize that adhering to the rule of law isn't just the job of governments. All actors in society, including all of us as citizens, have responsibilities to uphold effective legal systems. One influential societal actor that must step up is the private sector. Our age has been marked by the growth in the power and influence of mega oligopolists, by short-term profits being prioritized at all costs, and by precarious working conditions and lack of decent long-term economic prospects for far too many. Globalization and the ever-increasing power of major corporations and capital have contributed significantly to our current predicament, where companies too often benefit from weak legal systems and lack of effective regulations. Evidence shows that economic integration over recent decades, while greatly benefiting some, also brought about rising inequality and job precarity in many countries, spurring populism and nationalist reactions. We should acknowledge the important efforts that have been made to address these problems, including agreement on international frameworks, like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and steps at national and regional levels to make these standards binding, most recently with the European Union's long-awaited Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive coming into force. The act is intended to foster sustainable and responsible corporate behavior in companies' operations across their global value chains. Of course, there are limits on the extent to which individual businesses can achieve the due diligence objectives set out in such regulations. Greater cooperation among industries, as well as joint actions with governments, companies, trade unions, and civil society actors all working together, will be critical to achieving better performance over time. And I'm aware that here in Taiwan, you are taking important steps to localize international norms and standards into domestic legal frameworks, including innovative ways to replicate the system of periodic reviews of international human rights treaties, as well as with respect to business activities. I was pleased to learn from my colleagues at the Institute for Human Rights and Business about the inaugural Taiwan International Business Forum held earlier this year, aimed at increasing corporate awareness on human rights and environmental due diligence. Taiwanese businesses and international brands with value chains in Taiwan are all have responsibilities to respect human rights in line with international standards. Ongoing actions in this area should be welcomed, and these efforts should continue, including following up with the second version of Taiwan's National Action Plan on business and human rights, and working with partners to make further progress. Leaders in the wider region must play their roles as responsible stakeholders as well. During my time as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, I saw, through the development of the UN Global Compact, Corporate Citizenship Initiative, how business leaders around the world, including in the Asia-Pacific region, could play a bigger role in advancing respect for human rights, improving labor standards and environmental protection, and fostering greater transparency. Business leaders increasingly understood that they didn't need to wait for governments to act in order to adopt effective policies or monitoring. They recognized that consumers, investors, and their own employees were demanding more responsible performance at every level. The Global Compact has developed its own useful business and rule of law framework, drawing on the experience of companies who understand that effective and credible legal systems are essential for successful economies. I should note here as well that on my 6 official visits to China as UN High Commissioner, I witnessed a country that was growing enormously in wealth and increasingly integrating into global markets. It was also facing its own challenges as a global leader. China was making enormous commitments in lifting people out of poverty and improving education and health, and I gave China credit for protecting economic and social rights. But I also stressed at the time that the broad human rights agenda needed to protect civil liberties, such as free speech and assembly, and needed an independent judiciary, as well as protections against arbitrary detention, discrimination against marginalized populations, or other forms of abuse. I recall a particular visit to China in 2019 when my fellow elders and I met President Xi Jinping and other senior leaders. We discussed a wide range of important issues, from climate change to international development efforts like the Belt and Road Initiative, to nuclear non-proliferation, and China's role in respecting global leadership. In all our discussions, including informative and encouraging meetings with students, the elders stressed the importance of human rights and international standards and institutions in achieving sustainable development and a stronger sense of global solidarity. Sadly, there hasn't been an opportunity for follow-up to these conversations since then, but we remain ready to engage constructively. All of this is to stress that in addition to making sure that their own activities do not harm the rights of workers and wider communities, business leaders around the world should recognize their power to serve as influential advocates for social change and do more to make the case for the importance of rule of law in healthy societies. Unfortunately, the reality today is that while some leaders are trying to help, too much power continues to be exercised by a relatively small number of autocratic and largely male leaders of countries, as well as heads of major companies, who instead of speaking up for human rights and rule of law, are too frequently leading the pushback against more responsible governance, including corporate governance. We can see this in the continuing backlash against environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, integration in investing, coming from a group of influential politicians and business people. These voices are also challenging diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives as part of what they call a war on woke capitalism. The fact is, where effectively implemented, such efforts are not only the right thing to do, but are also good for the bottom line. Divisive business actors and others, such as those in the fossil fuel lobby working against climate action, are doing a real disservice to meaningful and material ESG integration that can be principled and profitable. We need to hear more business leaders pushing back against such divisive rhetoric. Above all, we need to encourage a sense of connection between all of us who are striving for that healthier, fairer, renewable energy-powered world. And that is what Project Dandelion, a women-led climate justice movement, is seeking to do. You can see that I have the dandelion I'm wearing. I'm not at this side. And my husband is loyally wearing one as well. In Project Dandelion, we are inspired by the dandelion itself, which grows on all continents, is both resilient and regenerative of the soil, and can be consumed in its entirety, and is spread by blowing the seeds. Already, Project Dandelion has connected with many networks, including a multi-faith, women-led climate action network, which I'm pleased to be invited to their second meeting in Rome in October. Connecting networks like this is a way of growing our power to influence climate and nature outcomes. Project Dandelion is women-led, but not women-only. As well as faith-based groups, we hope to link with indigenous communities, young people, progressive business, scientists, artists, farmers, etc., and show that we are, in fact, the majority in the world who want to see the right action on the climate and nature crisis. I conclude by acknowledging that all the proposals I've outlined here may seem modest, given the scale of challenges we face today. But we must begin somewhere. Actions can start today by taking what my fellow elders and I are calling long-view leadership at all levels of society, internationally, nationally, regionally, and locally. For us, this means decision makers must consistently demonstrate the courage to think beyond short-term political cycles and deliver solutions for both current and future generations. Recognize that enduring answers require compromise and collaboration for the good of the whole world. Show compassion for all people, designing sustainable policies which respect that everyone is born free and equal in dignity and rights. Uphold the international rule of law and accept that durable agreements require transparency and accountability. And finally, commit to a vision of hope in humanity's shared future and not play to its divided past. Just imagine if all governments worked accountably to serve their people and included effective participation by civil society, by young people, by women leaders at all levels. What if all listened to and were informed by the wisdom of indigenous peoples, grounding us in our true relationship with nature? What if we found new ways to distribute political and economic power more equitably for the benefit of all? Despite the serious threats we face, I believe we can build that world. This can be a time for democratic resurgence, a time for recommitment in shared values and identities that bind us together as one human family, as we draw on the richness of our diversity and celebrate our unique cultures and histories. This can be a moment when local ownership and global standards become mutually reinforcing, when state sovereignty and international cooperation align for the benefit of all. If we can embed a shared commitment to rule of law, to human rights and multilateral diplomacy in the ways we structure our societies and economies, I have every confidence that we will reach a more peaceful, sustainable, and just future for all, no matter how daunting current challenges may seem. So I thank you again for honoring me today, and I commend to you the exhortation of the founder of the Elders, Nelson Mandela. It always seems impossible until it is done. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Professor Robinson. Thank you for your lecture. And now we would like to invite back to the stage Professor Ye to give us the conclusion. Welcome, Professor Ye.
Well, thank you, Professor Robinson, for giving us such an insightful presentation. And I guess all of us in the audience all agree with me that this is not only a powerful speech, but it's also inspiring speech to us in Taiwan, and maybe even beyond in the region, because Professor Robinson mentioned about so many names of the region, name of the country, or even some respected personalities for us to think about linking from what we sort of imagine and what happened before, inside Taiwan and beyond in the region or in the globe. So it's a journey while you are talking. It's a journey for us to think about the trajectory of rule of law, but even beyond that, humanity, environment, sustainability, or even current generation and next generation, as you emphasized so much. So the depth and width of that has actually very well taken. Thank you so much. We all know that the concept of rule of law is not a static one. And at the same time, it's also important to know that the understanding of the global crisis should be redefined from time to time. And these global crises are no longer traditional and often bring impact larger than ever, such as the pandemic that we just experienced, adverse impact of information technology, as you mentioned, misinformation, disinformation, and in particular, climate change with impact across the boundary of space and time. And I was very, very touched when you sort of talked us into the seriousness and also the importance of recognizing that climate crisis from the perspective of humanity, justice, actually people and land. And that's really an inspiring perspective. And I believe Professor Robinson's lecture today has brought an opportunity to rethink the meaning and the function of rule of law in the face of non-traditional crisis. How it is strengthened and weakened, be it by chance or systematic, and how it should be restored to become an answer, if not solution, to these unprecedented challenges. Professor Robinson has also demonstrated to us that the whole picture is indeed a very complex one. It involves actually multi-level governance. Starting from UN, you mentioned quite a bit about UN's role, and regional, national, community, localities, and also with multiple players or actors. Particularly, you emphasize the very important role could be played by private sectors, business, civil society, and that. And I think with that level of inclusion, you sort of picture this rule of law, in a way that gets so closer to the reality. It's not something on the book, particularly not something in the statutes. And in fact, inspired by you, we need to find the soul and spirits out of the statutory book. So rule of law is not follow, the statute or going by the book only. We have a fresh, human body to take care of, freedom to take care of, speech, and also dignity to take care of. Even the impacts of the dynamics are not constrained by time. So, as I just mentioned, and you repeat that many times, the next generation. if we take the rights of next generation seriously, and we really need to consider and take it seriously about a changing concept and evolving content of rule of law. And another important takeaway from Professor Robinson's lecture is the importance of local context that works together with shared values. As we all know, the world could be divided by many lines, depending on what kind of line you are drawing. But there is one line which is really sort of demonstrate the complexity of the global landscape. On the one hand, we may have universalists trying to argue the world are going to be the same, follow the same standard, and it's going to be there, and these international human rights covenants are going to rule the world once and for all. But we also have, as you term, domestic extremists. They try to lock themselves into the local context, arguing the importance or the seriousness of the salient feature of the locality. Your talk actually brings about a possibility that we go in between these extremes and try to build up a world of just and also look into the future with meaningful dialogue supported by transparency and credible information. So those are what we need to do and require civil society to gain the final role and muscle in the landscape of democratic governance. I also want to repeat what you just said, one sentence which is very strong. You say, in this troubled global world and political conflicts, there are different kinds of practice of rule of law in the world, and we should hold national leaders accountable. And I heard that, I found this is really courageous and also you just hit the nail on the head. As now, if we take care of global justice seriously, there are many, many national leaders, they are not live up to their promise to the people. And the international human rights standard must be applied. And also not only resort to that kind of legal or monolithic appeal. The international community need to have something and really come up with something. If we don't have that right now, and we really need to come up with something, if we think we happen to be born in one country, that you happen to be born in Ireland and I happen to be born in Taiwan, but we are world citizens. We really care about humanity. And I think you have illuminated that kind of global thinking very well to us. And in Taiwan's context, aside from government's consistent effort, civil society also actually play an essential role in bridging international and domestic law. and through actions, dialogue, and discourse in public and private domain. Taiwan tried very hard to make itself part of the regional and international order in different spheres, and thus contributing to the dynamics of rule of law in its own way. So yes, we have experienced the dynamic of rule of law and the democratic constitutionalism in this dynamic island, striving for sustainability. And the road we travel and the footprint we have left, and also the future that we are heading to, actually should be a lesson and also an asset to the region and also to the world. Maybe through your effort, through your work internationally and globally, you will be able to link Taiwan to other areas. Knowing our spirit, knowing what kind of hardship that people here are dealing with, and what kind of spirit and also inspirational drive that we people have. With that, thank you so much. And I think the audience have learned a lot and also must begin to think that there must be something that we can do in Taiwan and also beyond Taiwan, in the region and in the globe. We may, inspired by your idea, begin to redefine our curriculum, redefine our agenda, and may be able to follow your inspiration and the work you have been doing and try our best, not to survive, but also to shine in the globe. Ladies and gentlemen, may I invite all of you to join me to give Professor Mary Robinson a round of applause for her wonderful lecture. Thank you so much, Professor Robinson.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to Professor Ye for the conclusion. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the Laureate lecture for Rule of Law. Our laureate, Professor Robinson, has to leave now for the press conference. Can we please give her another one round of applause? Thank you so much for her insightful and wonderful lecture today.